So I think with that, if the CSCS Riders group, who is in a separate room, is ready to say hello and wave to the camera, I think there they are. Yep. If you all can just kind of wave. So that's them here in the church. We're all getting our stuff ready tonight, and we'll be all set to move off tomorrow morning. So yeah, thanks again for you all for coming tonight.
Great, thanks Isaac, and thanks to all the riders. So we have 16 riders and 2 leaders and 2 support people also. And we won't take the time to introduce everybody, but there is a place on the website where you'll be able to find that, and I'll point that out here in just a little bit. So before we get started with kind of the keynote event for tonight, which is the town hall event, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I do want to talk just a little bit about the Climate Ride and kind of the purpose of the Climate Ride and how this came about. So I'm going to share my screen again. First thing I want to say about the Climate Ride is that we have a lot of people who have been supporting this. So not just the riders that have been involved and the leaders and everybody, but institutions as well. CSCS, and I'll talk about this later, but we are a partnership between EMU, Goshen College, and Mennonite Central Committee. So we have support from them as well. But we also have some sponsors. Our lead partner who's helping to sponsor this is MEDA. Many of you will know MEDA if you're in the Anabaptist world, the Mennonite Economic Development Associates. So they are our leader partner, and I want to share with you just a short recorded video from them in just a second here. But we have other people as well. Regen, Everence, Ruth and Timothy Solsfus Jost were major sponsors that helped us to make sure that this ride happened. There's some of the other sponsors that you can see right here, in addition to all the other folks which are not listed on here, but have helped in many different ways. Some of that has gone out, for instance, through the social media posts. So I just want to give a public appreciation on behalf of everybody at CSCS and everybody involved with the Climate Ride to make this happen. As you can imagine, this is a pretty big undertaking, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of stuff in the background in order to pull this off. And so, yeah, we thank them. I want to play, so MEDA, because they are our lead partner and they've been very supportive. I just have a very short video clip. Here we go.
I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts today on MEDA's behalf at this kickoff event. The need for increased awareness on climate change is more critical than ever. Experts paint a grim picture of a point of no return, and it's not far off. I am personally reminded of this reality today as I record this message for you, on Friday as I'll be away for the weekend. And it's snowing here in Ontario. On Tuesday, my husband and I played tennis in 31-degree weather. Both are extremely atypical for Ontario at the end of May. We all have ways in which climate change is observable and touches our lives. However, as is often the case, those primarily responsible for getting us into this mess are not the ones who will feel its effects most severely. We know increased temperatures around the equator in many of the countries where MEDA works means that soon farmers will no longer be able to grow the staple crops that have sustained their families for generations. The maize belt, for example, will be shifting north and south, leaving the most vulnerable people in the world even more vulnerable. That's why MEDA integrates an environment and climate change lens into our work. In the agri-food sector, it can't be ignored. We help create the business case for farmers and agribusinesses to apply inputs and techniques that will maintain healthy, strong soil that retains moisture during erratic rainy seasons, holds nutrients, minimizing the need to engage in a cycle of heavy chemical application year after year. And these fields emit less. It's a win-win. We're also working with agri-food processors to buy down the risk of entering the green economy. Our environmental innovation grants match 50% of the cost of cleaner technology to showcase that this new equipment can be just as profitable. In many ways, people and businesses where we work have the opportunity to leapfrog the harmful practices that we here in Canada and the US have become entrenched in, practices that are simply not sustainable. Their trajectory can be different from ours. they can actually lead the way through this act of leapfrogging, as they've already shown that they're able to do through telecommunications. That's the end that we're working towards. It's so good to see the church taking action to be a good steward of the earth that God entrusted us with, our beautiful home. And what better way to raise awareness than biking across the country? MEDA is proud to partner with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions broadly through our participation in their board of reference, and specifically to be sponsoring this climate ride. On behalf of MEDA, I wish everyone a successful.
Right, got to unmute. Thank you again for MEDA. I encourage you to check out their website and the work that they do. That was incidentally Leah Katterberg is her name. She's Vice President of Innovation and Impact. Okay, so I want to share. So the Climate Ride, I just want to say a few words about that, kind of where the Climate Ride started. Our organization, CSCS, we are an organization that works obviously with climate issues. So we come with a conviction that the climate issue is at least one of the, if not the most important issue, right, for our time. We also have a conviction that Anabaptist communities have something unique and important to say to that. Not only Anabaptists, obviously, there's many other organizations that work with this issue, but we do believe deeply that we have something unique to say, and that there are many Anabaptists out there that can be engaged with us along with other partners. And that other people are interested in the types of things that we have to say. We also believe that raising awareness, a large part of that is having the conversations, and conversations are about listening to the stories that people have, listening to the concerns and different perspectives that people have. So that is really what this ride is about. We've subtitled this ride Moving the Story, which is kind of a double, it's supposed to be read a little bit of a double meaning. So we're taking the story of the riders and we're moving it across the United States over this 2-month period, stopping in communities, talking with people, talking with organizations, and learning and conveying that to folks like you who are following this ride. It's also, we hope, moving the story of climate. So we need to move how we think about climate change. We need to make some movement on that. And we hope that this will be an important step in that direction. These types of conversations, they're not easy conversations, as everybody knows. They can be hard conversations. We anticipate that. As a group, we welcome that. That's part of the learning that will come out of it, part of the inspiration and the revelations that come along with the hopeful aspects of talking to many different people around the country about this. And all of those transformations will form the story that hopefully you're able to follow as these riders are going across the country. I want to show you just briefly here. Many of you have been to our website, but I just want to point out a few things about where you can engage with this trip. And I want to, before I go to that website real briefly, I just want to highlight the next kind of public event that we have, which is a webinar by Sarah Augustine. Many of you may have heard of Sarah Augustine. She's spoken in many of the Anabaptist circles. She's a Pueblo woman who has thought a lot about the doctrine of discovery and the church's response to that. So when the climate riders are in South Dakota at Crazy Horse, Sarah Augustine is going to be joining virtually and talking especially about this book, which she will actually be releasing the day before our webinar. So the timing is good. She has graciously given that book, access to that book, to all of the climate riders who will be reading that ahead of time and can be having a conversation with Sarah as well. So this will be a good chance to talk about Indigenous perspectives and issues and concerns with respect to climate change. So that is the coming event. Where you can find a full list of these types of events, I'm going to switch over now to another screen. So this is the website. If you've been to the website before, you know that there are some buttons down here. These kind of outline, these blue boxes outline the ways that you can engage. We have a weekly update. If you want to receive this in your email, you can go there. You can sign up. The sign up is actually down here as well, where it says to subscribe. This will have updates and pictures from the trip. It will also have starters of the reflections. So the writers are doing deeper reflections, which we're linking through those weekly updates, and then if I can get the website to go there, you'll find these essays which talk about different aspects of the trip from the perspective of these individual writers. And there are some that are posted already from before the trip. So really good pieces there. I encourage you to go to this Stories from the Saddle piece. We do have these town halls and other events which can be joined in some cases in person, but also virtually. This is the first of what we call these community town halls. It's an attempt to bring together people to a panel, which will always include some writers. So we have a couple of writers here tonight, which will give their perspective on these particular topics. This is not like a lecture or talk by these individuals, but it's more of a conversation between them and the moderator, and Isaac will be moderating the one that we have tonight. But you can see that the other ones that are coming up here, we have, in addition to Sarah's webinar, we have 3 other: Lincoln, Nebraska, Goshen, Indiana, and Washington, D.C., each with their own themes and a good lineup of people that I think that you'll want to hear. We do have social media as well, so if you're on Instagram and Facebook, then watch for daily posts as people talk not only about the more in-depth discussions they have about climate, but just the daily routine challenges and obstacles that they run across as they're going on this journey of over 3,000 miles. If you want to know more about the writers, you can go to this link down here. This has pictures of all the writers in addition to their profiles. In some cases, there are some video clips, much like the video clips that I was showing you just at the start of this webinar, if you were joining right at your time. And then finally, if you want to know where they go, if you want to know if they're coming close to you, you can go to the route part here. It's listed by day down below, but you can also click on this map, which takes you to an interactive map, which shows you basically exactly where the group is going. In addition to the formal events, the writers will be talking to people informally as well. If they're coming close to your town and you would like to, have coffee with them or something and just chat, then you can find out where they're going and you can get in touch with us, and we'll try to put the writers in touch with you. So I invite you to explore that website for all the ways that you can be engaging with that. Okay, so that's an introduction to the Climate Ride. So we want to transition over now to the town hall event. We have a number of guests that are with us, and we're looking forward to a good conversation with these folks. So I'm going to pass it back over to Isaac. And Isaac, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, well, great. So I'm going to quickly introduce each of our panelists. So if we can have each panelist kind of give a quick wave as I introduce you, then we'll get to meet who we're going to be talking to tonight and then get started on our town hall conversation. So first up is Caleb Schrockhurst. He's a writer and he's an EMU grad and a seminary student currently at Eastern Mennonite Seminary. Greta Lapp-Klassen. She's also a writer here with us, and she's a student at Goshen College. Kate Yoder is the associate editor at GRIST, which is here in Seattle, a local climate media organization. Daniel Penner, who's the senior video editor and producer at GRIST, that same company. And then Elaine Hickman, who's a member of the Seattle Mennonite Church and involved in a number of local sustainability groups and organizations as well. So I think that we'll kick it off tonight by talking to our panelists from here on our writer crew, Caleb and Greta. So you all can each respond to the question. Caleb, if you want to go first, that would be fine. Yeah, what are you all most excited about for this trip coming up?
Yeah, I think I'm most excited about the ability just to really see the US at a pace that we can absorb. I was one of the people who drove the support vehicle full of all the bikes from Harrisonburg, Virginia out here to Seattle. And that was just such an interesting way, like a taste, I think, of what this trip will really be. But traveling by bike and, thinking about climate at the same time, traveling by bike is one of the ways I've best experienced to really feel that I can experience everything as I move from place to place and really connect with the land and nature in a way that we often don't in our modern world. So I'm really excited to do that.
Yeah, I agree with Caleb. I recently in training have been noticing how I have been living in this same area for my whole life, and I'm just now discovering so many different parts of it because I've been going by bike instead of by car. And so I'm excited to do that on like a huge scale with the whole country. And in a similar vein, I'm really excited to connect more with my body, especially as a student and the last year with so much on Zoom and just being at home and sitting and not really moving a lot and spending so much of my days just like completely still. I'm excited to be connecting with the earth while I'm connecting with my body and being active for 8+ hours each day and not being cooped up in my house and being able to hear the elements every night as we camp. So yeah, I think just deeper level of connectivity with everything.
Yeah, well, thanks to both of you. Yeah, and I would echo both of you all that I'm also excited for a lot of those same reasons. I think that there's going to be a lot of really good things to come out of this summer. So, and also for the folks listening and watching here tonight, feel free to put questions into the chat. You can direct those either to Doug Neufeld or just to everyone in the chat, and then we'll begin filtering those in near the end. If you all have something that you want to know in particular about one of the panelists or about our ride. So then our next question is also for Greta. I'm curious what your story of coming to care for the earth and the environment is, and why you decided to join this summer's climate ride. I mean, our theme this summer is kind of moving the story. So yeah, I guess what's your story, Greta?
Yeah, I grew up in Goshen, Indiana, but I spent time visiting my family out in Pennsylvania and also in Kansas. So I spent a long time in different types of environments. And I also went to summer camp almost every year. And I think these experiences were like really formative for me in just enjoying being outside. And when I was in middle school, I started having formative experiences in which I became aware about climate change. So I remember once spending a week-long trip with my friends on a boat, and it was hard for me to enjoy the water and the scenery because there was trash everywhere. And it was little experiences like this when I was in middle school that made me really interested about climate change. And for a while, I thought that I would become an environmental scientist or a marine biologist or something like that. But I've always been drawn to storytelling, and it just didn't feel like the right fit. But for a while, I felt like if I wanted to make positive change on something that I cared about so much, I had to, become a scientist. So I think something about this climate ride that I like is that it lets me really like share the story of climate change, which is something that I feel like I'm really talented in, and not have to be, an actual scientist to do that. And I've heard about cross-country bike rides. And I think once I heard about the tradition of dipping your tire in one coast and then dipping it in the other, I was just hooked, and I always wanted to do that. And so when I found out this opportunity, I just knew I had to try to try to do it. So yeah.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for you, today was the day when we dipped our rear tire in the Pacific Ocean. We're here in the Puget Sound in Seattle, and then here in 2 months, then we'll dip our front tire in the Atlantic. So then our next question tonight is for Elaine. Elaine, have you noticed conversations and actions taken on climate change changing or shifting in your local community here in Seattle over the course of your life in your sustainability circles? And maybe also how is Seattle Mennonite involved in these climate issues?
How long do you have? Well, I was in college at the time of the first Earth Day. So it's been a big part of my life, though it didn't really turn towards environmental issues so much until probably in the early 2000s. But Seattle is a great place to live and be a climate activist, because there are so many amazing activists, and it's really a lively place to be. Probably what really launched it here locally was the Shell when we resisted the Shell oil rig that was headed to Alaska. And there's a great organization that I like to support called Backbone Campaign. And they're the ones that organized all those kayaktivists that literally surrounded that oil rig. And there was just so much excitement at that time, and a lot of people participated in all different ways. I've seen that's a form of direct action. There's been a lot of other direct action here that's inspired me. A group called the Valve Turners. There were 5 people that I knew, who you may have heard. They all on the same day, they turned off the oil pipelines, all the oil pipelines coming from Canada into the US. And, you know, they all, of course, and they did it nonviolently and notified the authorities. And so, you know, were arrested and went through so much. At least one of them served time in prison for that action. So all those things really inspire me. And then there've been a number of examples in recent years where we've actually stopped fossil fuel projects that were being proposed and being sort of foisted on the state. And the people just have risen up and organized and shown that we do have power when we get together and work together. Well, regarding Seattle Mennonite, I can't say that we've had a really clear, big campaign about climate change. We have hosted on several occasions, documentary movies put on by a local group called Faith Action Climate Team, which has been an inspiring group of people who wanted to do their action out of their faith and belief. And although they come from a variety of different faith backgrounds, they work together from that principle. They put on a couple of big conferences with speakers and workshops and all of that. And they offered a training for clergy on how to address this in their congregation. And our pastor, Megan Reimer, participated in that. And in 2015, we often have had a street kind of a Good Friday event in downtown Seattle usually. And in 2015, it was focused on the creation and the threat of oil trains was kind of an issue at that time. So yeah, one thing I'd hope that I've been hoping that we're going to do that we haven't done yet is as a church to do tree planting. And I think that's something that's specifically counters CO2 emissions is planting trees. So there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. It's really empowering to hear all those things that you've noticed and been a part of here in the Seattle community. Yeah, and then also based here in Seattle, then we have Daniel and Kate's organization, GRIST. And so Daniel, the tagline for GRIST is Climate Justice Solutions. Can you explain a little bit more about exactly what it is that GRIST does and how GRIST embodies these 3 principles?
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. I mean, I guess first and foremost, GRIST does journalism. And so that's articles, that's video, that's audio. Yeah, and so we cover the climate and the environment. And I think, I guess GRIST has been around since 1999. And it started back then, GRIST, I wasn't around then, but it felt like it was sort of more hand waving, saying like, hey, like climate change is happening. Like this is a thing that we should all pay attention to. And at the time, it was something like 40% of people thought climate change was happening. Over the past 20 years, that's changed. Like that number is closer to 75%. And there is just a lot more awareness that this is an issue that we need to solve. And there's a lot more places that are saying, oh, this is a bad thing. This is how it's going wrong. And so GRIST has shifted a lot more to solutions or this justice component, which, you know, a lot of these effects are borne out by people who have very little to do with the problem in the first place. And so kind of just looking at, you know, like an example of our coverage is a recent piece looking at Lake Charles, Louisiana, where they're facing erosion of the coast, sea level rise, and getting battered by really intense hurricanes. And just kind of looking at these really serious situations that they're facing, considering retreating and moving, like leaving their homes for generations, or you know, or dealing with this kind of consistent flooding. Or it can also look like some of the work with trying to capture carbon, whether that's trees, or looking at a company that it's trying to put carbon in the ground, and like doing the reporting and the diligence, saying like, okay, does this align with the science? Is what they're saying accurate? And just trying to focus on these solutions and making sure that that future world is something that that everybody's included in, where we do solve climate change. So.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Kate, so in your work at GRIST, what are some of the ideas that you need to really consider when writing pieces about climate change and other controversial topics?
Yeah, I think it's super important to consider the audience, like who's going to be reading your work, and also the reason why you're writing it, obviously. But often in my work at GRIST, I'm, you know, looking to inform people who are already like interested in or curious about climate change. So I don't necessarily need to tiptoe around the subject. Like the people who are going to click on a story about climate change are usually already interested in it in some way. But that said, I do think it's really important to keep my work grounded in facts and to link to sources. Just in general, like questioning my preconceived ideas sometimes helps me like find that things are more complicated than I thought at first. And so I think that linking to stuff is really good, especially for people who want to learn more. But I do think that's something to avoid when writing about controversial issues, is to like avoid the frame of thinking about both sides. One, because there's almost always more than two sides. So it's a balanced way of writing is more about evaluating things fairly and considering different perspectives and how valid they are. And so in general, I like to try to stay away from binaries. I think they're kind of dangerous and part of how we got into this polarized mess in this country. So trying to break that framing instinct, which is like really built into America at this point, I think it's important to try to not talk about things always as like a fight or a battle or a political win, and instead like lay out why it actually matters to people, you know, for their lives. But yeah, I mean, writing is interesting because it's much different from a conversation in that it's sort of like one way, like you're in your head and you can't really, it's with a conversation, you can ask questions to other like people and listen to the answer and respond. So in a way, I think conversations are like a more forgiving way of communication. But on the other hand, there's also like potentially more conflict, with which Mennonites like famously want to avoid, right? Definitely have some of that. So I think that, you know, I think that like there's this tendency to want to avoid conflict, but also that it's often a good sign that people actually have a stake in an issue and care about it. So like, obviously you don't want to get into a shouting match, like that's not going to be productive, but I think that working through conflict can be really valuable in terms and like around climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, I guess it can be really challenging to hold lots of those different people's perspectives and opinions and and conversation pieces. So yeah, thanks to people like you who do the writing and publicize those issues. So it's good work.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So Caleb, you've done some work overseas with MCC in the past. What do you think that taught you about communicating with people?
Yeah, so I served with MCC for 2 years, first through the SALT program, and Greta actually also participated in that program. I was in Vietnam, and then I spent a second year there in Vietnam, and I actually wrote a short book called 65 Years of Walking Together, the MCC Vietnam Story, which is a history of MCC's, more than 6 decades of work in a country that has been severely affected by, obviously, American foreign policy decisions in the past, but now faces an extreme climate crisis, really because of continuing actions among the global north. A quick fact that I know is that about 20 million people in Vietnam live at or below sea level. So as we see the sea level rise 1 meter or 2 meters over the next 20 or 30 years, what are we going to do with 20 million people who will have to leave the area of the Mekong Delta where all the rice for Southeast Asia is grown? So when we think about these massive challenges, what I think MCC really enables the Anabaptist community to do is a little catchphrase that I love. It's a portmanteau called glocalization. So how can we both globalize and localize at the same time? And I think that keeping those two things in mind with climate is what is most necessary. If we aren't grounded in our local cultures and our local communities, even those conflicts there, we won't be able to truly learn from people abroad. And so it's a real joy for me to be able to have been a part of a community over there in Southeast Asia for 2 years, and to try to globalize as we experience the US now, just to remember how our actions here really do affect people all around the world, affect food security, affect quality of life.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. Yeah, I guess there's just all different kinds of ways of communicating. And yeah, you highlighted a lot there, and Kate talked about a number as well. Yeah, and speaking of communicating, you panelists are also welcome to respond to any other panelists throughout the course of our conversation tonight. If something that somebody else says you find really interesting. So feel free to butt in and interrupt me at any point if you choose. And speaking of communicating as well, Daniel, your work as the senior video producer at Grist means that you have some say in the videos that are created. This as well as a form of communication and getting a point across to people who are watching these videos. So how do you decide which topics to make the focus of your pieces?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a complicated question. It can shift quite a bit for each video. I think one of the things is we are a team. There are 2 full-time video producers at Grist, including myself, and it's an organization of 50. And so there are just a lot of reporters like Kate, talking to sources, having conversations with people. And so a lot of times I'll talk to them like, oh, what are you thinking of? What are you working on? And that will kind of help uncover some of these interesting ideas. And I think it's important, like we always ask, like, oh, why is this a video as opposed to an article? Because yeah, so much as the medium affects the message or how people receive it. I think, like, I often think of video as a very emotional medium. It's a way that you can understand what someone's experiencing in a much deeper and tangible way. You don't have to say like, oh, this person was crying. You can see it. And one of the examples of that was a few years ago. I mean, this has been ongoing. There was a lot of, and there continues to be, obviously, like a lot of youth and climate activism, like all these young people seeing kind of what the next 20, 30 years looked like. And it was like a pretty disappointing, it is a pretty disappointing picture if we don't do something about it. There was we started wondering, video seems like a good way to tell one of these stories. And so we did a little research, and we saw that there was a high schooler, a 16-year-old at the time in Seattle, who had coordinated this national march on Washington with a number of students throughout the country. And so just, we had a number of interviews, and we talked to her, and yeah, I don't know, in those series of interviews, planning with the marchers or interviewing her and her fellow teens in DC, and talking with her parents, like, you kind of saw like the weight that she felt, just like feeling like all these people that she assumed would figure things out and like let her live a normal childhood. Like, you kind of felt like the lament from both her and her parents of feeling like she had to spend a lot for youth raising awareness and getting people to talk about climate change. And yeah, I guess I could go on, but it'd probably be better just to watch the video, which I can yeah, follow up in some way. But yeah, there's just a lot of things that go into it. Yeah, that's one way. So
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Daniel. So Elaine, I'm curious what has motivated you to be working for change in your community and for the environment, both now and in the past.
Thank you. Well, I'd start with my family culture, where I started from. I grew up in a small town in Eastern Washington. You'll be going within 50 miles of there when you stay at Tico. So I come from a line of farmers. My great grandfather homesteaded in Whitman County, and I have been a gardener all my life. And so I have a strong sense of place and connection to the earth. I've lived in Washington State my whole life. And as a family, we did a lot of things connected to nature, and I learned to value beauty. And so all of this connection to this planet that we live on. So when it struck me, I'd say in the 90s sometime, late 90s maybe, that we were really, that climate change was a thing, and that life was, as I knew it, was under threat. It was just really a frightening experience. And and there's also a lot of grief with that, because the way of life that I love is under threat. And I just can't help but think how profound it is when we hear of, like the example at the beginning of this session of the woman in Ontario, where it was snowing and it had been 31 degrees Celsius the day before. I mean, as a gardener, I know that the natural world is really affected by those kind of unusual swings. And yet we've had I guess I'd say, the luxury to rely on the predictability of nature. That's what gardeners do. We know when to plant. We know, we know what the threats are, and when they might come, and when the last frost is, and when the first frost is. And to mix all of that up and take away that predictability, I just grieve for what it means for human culture and all species. And of course, many species won't survive those changes, and besides the other threats. So that motivates me to fight for trying to at least minimize those impacts in some way. I don't have children myself, but I still love children. So a lot of people are motivated by, looking ahead to what kind of future their grandchildren and great grandchildren will have. But that certainly is still important to me. I think recently I've been more and more impacted by indigenous wisdom. A lot of our climate work here in this area is led by indigenous people. And I've learned a lot from their teachings about how all of life is connected. And there's a certain humility that indigenous people have, that they don't see themselves as superior, as the superior species on the planet, but that everything is about cooperation and collaboration, versus the metaphor, sadly, that I think, sadly, Christianity, Christian culture taught was that human beings were to dominate, we're entitled to dominate and exploit and use nature for their own purposes. So I just continue to look more and more to indigenous people for their wisdom and understanding. And I heard an indigenous leader just recently say very emphatically that they have had understanding of how the things are interconnected and how to manage the earth for millennia. And Western science is now beginning to verify scientifically many of the principles that they have known from experience and passed down through the generations. And it's sad that it's taken Western science so long to catch on. So I as I look around, I'm hopeful that it seems like indigenous people are getting more and more acknowledgement and maybe victories. We now have a Secretary of Interior who's a Native American person. And I'm just hopeful that they will be given more their rightful place as leaders, because we really desperately need their leadership. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Yeah, you mentioned a lot about thinking about indigenous wisdom, and Doug mentioned earlier that one of our common reads for our group this summer is "This Land Is Not Empty" by Sarah Augustine, and then we're also reading "Braiding Sweetgrass" by Robin Wall Kimmer, who's another indigenous author. And so we're having a lot of good conversation, and I'm sure that more is to come about those benefits as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Greta, so as an English major at Goshen College and someone who's passionate about climate change and the environment, what do you think that you bring to a conversation about climate advocacy and awareness?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when I tell them that I'm an English major, just think that I, read Shakespeare, read poetry, and it doesn't really have an impact on life or like.
I was an English major too, yeah.
Yeah. So I think sometimes it gets discounted as sort of just like a frivolous, pointless study that won't go to anything. But the reason I've been drawn to it is just that I've always felt intuitively, I think, that humans communicate best through story. So I can hear something in a statistic, and then I can hear something in a story, and the story will always stick with me longer than the statistic might. And I also really love statistics, but I think that for me, they make most sense with a story. And so, yeah, as someone who knows both like journalism and creative writing, I think there is a lot of power in the words we write and the stories we share. And I think that if we want to convince people and invoke emotion and have real change done on this issue, we can't just throw a bunch of statistics at people without a moving story. And so I hope that I can, use my storytelling abilities to go back after this is over and do what I hope I do best, which is write and tell stories and hopefully get people interested. And maybe people like me who are bad at remembering statistics, but who are great at holding on to stories. So I think that, there's definitely a lot of room in advocacy circles for like humanities. And I think that if we discount that type of, if we discount that type of study, then we're leaving out a really important part of the work. So, yeah.
Thanks, Greta. Next one is also for one of our writers, for Caleb. So you're also in school right now at Eastern Mennonite Seminary. So how do you see messages in the Bible translated into advocacy and having conversations about climate change? And do you feel called or some kind of responsibility as a Christian peacemaker to engage with the issues of climate change?
Yeah, and one of our panelists touched on this earlier, but I think that there's a lot to be learned as those of us who come from European backgrounds and from long Christian traditions, that our Christian traditions have not always been positive on the issue of climate change. And so one of my passions and what I'm so happy to be doing now at seminary is revisiting familiar stories with a new lens in mind. How do we read scripture with racial justice in mind, with climate justice in mind? And when we do, stories that we have known since we were children can really come to life in a new way. Since it was already mentioned, I think the creation story is one that if we visit that in a new light, fill the earth and subdue it. What does that mean, translated from Hebrew and through thousands of years of cultural context? But how can we instead view our call as Christians and as people who care about the environment to be stewards of the earth? Because I do believe that is what we're called to. And in Braiding Sweetgrass, Ms. Krimmer shares a really great story of she asked a class of I believe environmental science majors in their junior or senior year for an example of a positive interaction between humans and the environment, and people couldn't give a single one. So for me, how do we tell these positive stories? Because I believe that's what we're called to do, both as Christians and as stewards of the earth. One other principle that I like to keep in mind, and I think it fits very well with Christianity and with climate advocacy and communication as well, is the goal of first to listen and then to learn and to love. So getting into this new issue, and for me, for this spring, it's been biking, but so many things. The first thing to do is to listen to the call to action. So right now we know we're in the middle of a climate crisis, but we can't stop after just listening to that. Then we have to go out and do some learning on our own. And then when we've done that, we can take that step of action, that step of loving, to try and bring about God's shalom, which we can't have true peace if we aren't at peace with our neighbors and at peace with the earth. And I love the ability to try and bring those things together in my seminary studies, but also, of course, now on the ride.
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, all great answers. So Kate, recently you wrote an article for GRIST titled "ExxonMobil Found the Real Reason for the Climate Crisis, You." You spoke about some of the differences between personal choice and the big picture action like policy change and advocacy. So can you explain a little bit more about what you see as the role of an individual in addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, for sure. So that study, it was based on a Harvard study that came out maybe a few weeks ago. And basically the researchers used 50 years worth of data from Exxon, just like publicly available documents. And they figured out how the company was talking about climate change differently in public versus in private, because some internal documents were available from different court cases and stuff. So surprise, surprise, they found that Exxon did talk differently in private and public. And one of the ways they did that is that they used language that kind of shifted the blame for climate change onto individuals. So that's sort of the idea that, Exxon is just sort of innocently providing the service that the people demand, which is fossil fuels. And it's sort of similar rhetoric that the tobacco industry used around smoking. And that's both like a PR strategy, and it's also like been used as a legal defense in court cases. So I'm really passionate about individual and collective action, and I could talk about this a lot, but to keep it brief, obviously, I think we need both. I do think that collective action needs more emphasis for a couple reasons. One is just that policy solutions are at a much bigger scale, and they address things that individuals can't do on their own. Like very few people have control over what's powering their electric grid, or I just moved into a new house and it has gas stove. I'm a renter, so like I can't do anything about that, but cities can, use laws to change that. And they can also make individual action easier. So if you live somewhere with good public transit and good urban design, then that can allow people to live without a car. But obviously individual action is really powerful from a moral dimension, and also from like the feeling of agency that you can get of actually doing something. And I've written about studies before that show that your actions can expand, just beyond yourself, because peer pressure can be used for good. So I've actually written about the power of positive peer pressure, which I think is really fascinating.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so this is also one for Greta and also for Kate. So specifically for Greta, what action around climate change do you see happening at your own college at Goshen? And then maybe Kate, you can follow that up with like, what do you think the role of youth and young adults is in the climate movement?
Yeah, so at Goshen, there's a pretty long history of climate activism, or like clubs that work to, raise awareness and start initiatives on campus. So there's been one club that's been around for a longer amount of time called Eco Packs, and they've been pretty active on campus, starting like composting initiatives in the cafeteria, and like providing recycling for the dorm floors, and like education about the different types of materials that can and can't be recycled, and also organizing groups to go to protests. And so I think recently protests have sort of sparked another group on campus that's sort of associated, which is a branch of the Sunrise Movement. So I'm sure many people have heard of the Sunrise Movement, but it's a worldwide, mostly based in the United States, movement of youth who work to advocate for mainly the Green New Deal, but other types of legislation surrounding climate change. So those are two groups that work hard on our campus. And also we have Mary Lee Environmental Learning Center, which students are able to take classes at and go and learn and work at, which is a really great resource for students. And a lot of students are able to go and spend the semester at Mary Lee, even if they aren't actually like an environmental science major or sustainability major. So providing opportunities like that for students that make it really like intersectional with all that they do. And this year with COVID, I think there was a big question of how they would distribute food. And I think some things could have been done better, but they did figure out a way to do reusable green containers instead of disposable every single day for 3 meals a day. So I think little initiatives like that have made a big impact on my campus. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Greta. It's interesting. I am also a former English major from Goshen College, so where I learned about climate change. So it's kind of interesting to hear like how the Sunrise Movement has expanded there and hear updates on that. But yeah, in general, I mean, I think the role of youth and young adults has been really huge in the climate movement recently, especially like the youth climate strikes a few years ago. That really changed the dynamic in the climate movement and kind of helped popularize the Green New Deal and just make like stronger political action more like generally accepted. And it's really interesting I've talked to a sociologist about this before, but young people often don't have a lot of avenues for political power because they can't vote until they're 18 and they can't hold office, obviously. So, I mean, they've had to find other ways to have an impact on institutions. And so I think that skipping school on Fridays is sort of reflective of that, which was, what students were doing to the climate strikes, because that's like one of the few ways that, high schoolers could really affect an institution and kind of make a statement that's kind of reverberates around the world. But yeah, obviously beyond that, as Greta mentioned, the Sunrise Movement has really pushed politicians for stronger and bolder action through protests and, other measures. And I think it's really interesting. There are some studies that have come out in the past couple of years that show that kids, I think like one of them looked at middle schoolers, are like able to help change their parents' minds on climate change a lot more than like you would ever think, which, I mean, that's a really, really hard thing to do considering polarization in America. So I think that's kind of a hopeful note. And even within the like Republican Party, the sort of young-ish folks like millennials and younger are much more on board with climate action. So that's kind of creating an interesting dynamic there too. But overall, I think the role of young people has just been to push the climate movement to a place that was basically unthinkable a couple of years ago politically.
Yeah, thanks, Kate and Greta. So Daniel, from your perspective, what are some of the most important ways people can affect change and start those conversations about climate change, both within and outside their own communities right now? And why do you feel that the Climate Ride is an important piece of this puzzle and way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of really good stuff shared. Just kind of, I feel like I could play back a lot of the answers where, yeah, so many people shared great things, and I think, one of the main ways to do that is to be talking about it and to have these conversations. There was a recent interview that we did with a meteorologist who has done a lot of work around climate change, where he's like, we need to make it a dining room table issue, because oftentimes we have placed climate change in this bucket of, oh, that's happening in the future, or that's happening to polar bears, and it's happening right now in front of us. It's affecting our communities, whether it's, changing planting season or filling our cities with smoke because of wildfires. And there's one of the articles of the past few years that we've done that was most popular. Well, we broke down this report from the US government about how climate was impacting different regions throughout the US. And like, we're based in Seattle, but we have people distributed throughout the US or are from different areas. And so we kind of each took a region where we were from and kind of talked about some of those impacts. And I think it had a really big impact because people were able to see like, oh, this is how it's going to affect Oklahoma. This is how it's going to affect Indiana. And when you are able to do that, to kind of tie it to your own backyard, you kind of get a sense of, oh, this is how it's going to affect my community. And I think that's what makes it just so valuable to have this climate ride, like to have those conversations in these different congregations. You can see what's happening in the backyard. You can kind of start the conversation and make it a kitchen table issue for people that don't know quite where to start. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, Elaine, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, and in listening to you, Daniel, part of me wants to say, I feel sad that we're still at a place where the conversation is persuading people that this is something that needs their attention. when, again, I'm going to go back to Indigenous people. Many Indigenous people are sacrificing their lives in defense of the future. You know, like the line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, where they're calling people for next weekend to come as people came to go to Standing Rock. But I've seen Indigenous leaders here, I'll name him, Paul Wagner, for instance, who he spent every day, I think, he's on the street, he's in the governor's face, he's doing something because it's that urgent. It's life or death for Indigenous people and their culture if the planet is goes the direction it's going. It's really serious. So I kind of want to amp it up somehow, that this isn't just a conversation, a debate. It's life and death, and it's here, it's now. And those are the stories I think that it would be good to have handy, is those stories of the here and now that you can try to get people to want to know more and to sympathize with and act.
Yeah, thanks, David and Elaine. Daniel and Elaine, sorry. Yeah, so I want to respect everyone's time and maybe answer a few of the questions here in the chat. So first off, then I have David Landis, one of the trip leaders here with me, who will answer the question about how we chose the route. And then right after that, then if I could have either Caleb or Greta answer Laura's question earlier about maybe something that you're excited or something that you think might be a challenge, either physically or mentally for this ride over the next 2 months. Yeah, David.
All right, thanks, Isaac. So the route, we're riding over 2 months from Seattle, Washington to Washington, D.C. And we chose a route based primarily on rail trails and greenway corridors, first of all, partially from a practical sense because it's a car-free corridor, it's safer for the riders, it has many services that are helpful for the group, but also it gives us a way to participate in green transportation in a way. And to look even back at like what was rail transportation like. Sometimes we're following a canal trail like from Cumberland, Maryland to Washington, D.C. So we based a route on a big long-term project called the Great American Rail Trail that's been initiated by the Rails to Trails Conservancy. And there's a lot of gaps in the rail trails for the Cross Country Rail Trail project. So we filled those in with smaller roads and tried to also connect a lot of wild places, natural places, so the group can also spend time there, reflecting on being in nature and seeing how climate change is affecting a lot of the public lands, especially in the West. And we also, of course, tried to tie in communities that are close to CSCS and to the participants, connecting to churches, to universities, wherever we can. So it was a combination of those factors, both practical and thematic, that work with the trip. We're really excited to try it out. So tomorrow we head up into the Cascades and really the adventure starts.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and then either Caleb or Greta, if one of y'all wants to go.
Yeah, I personally have never done anything nearly this intense for as long or just without as many breaks, and so I think that it'll be a challenge to stay on top of my game. Definitely need to be really intentional about recharging and recovering and you know, having time to reflect, because I think if those things don't happen, then it'll be really easy to burn out, or the possibility will be there.
To add on to that, I think both Greta and I are people who are not, you know, national level track competitors like Isaac Alderfer is, who flew here directly from national track competition. So we have some really, really excellent athletes, and David Landis and Joanna have biked across the country several times already. And then there are people like Greta and myself who have not done anything of that sort. But I think, you know, that ties nicely into climate as well, that this is something that we need to bring everyone along on, people with a lot of experience, like some people on this panel, and then people who are new to the party. And so it is an urgent issue, but there needs to be a place for everyone. And so, I mean, I do think that there will be a lot of physical challenges, but that's also exciting and what makes the group what it will be.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. I don't think that we're going to have time to get to any more of those tonight. But I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists for coming here tonight and having this conversation with us. It was great to have you guys all here. And I know that I feel much more empowered and much more educated to go out tomorrow on our exciting first day of our bike ride. So I think I'll go now to Doug, who's kind of got the finishing wrap up here.
Great. Thanks so much, Isaac, and thanks to the panelists also. I have to admit, I wasn't quite sure. This was our first town hall. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to go with what 5 or 6 different members, but it went wonderful. I thought I really appreciated the input folks had. I wish we had more time. Those of you that had me for class, you know that I always over plan for class, and I think I probably did that again, but still that's that's okay. So thank you again for that. Yeah, I just want to take the last 5 or 10 minutes, if you'll bear with me, to talk a little bit about CSCS, in part because folks may have heard of CSCS or maybe not. Either way, people often have questions about, you know, what is the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions and why are they doing this ride? So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here and share just a little bit. I'm actually going to, because one of the benefits of being the leader is that you have the bully pulpit a little bit, and you can tell stories also. This trip is about stories. Here's my very short story, and I promise it's relevant for why CSCS does what it does. These 2 pictures that I hope you can see here, these are Mwaya and Kanina. They are farmers in southeastern Kenya. I was with MCC in Kenya working with farmers in semi-arid regions and met many farmers who were being affected by climate change. This couple had 4 kids. They had moved to an area of Kenya because of population pressure in another area, actually. When they moved to this area some 15 years ago, they could grow crops there. Their rains were regular. These are rain-fed farmers, so the rains have to come at the right time, exactly what Elaine, what you were talking about earlier. That's changed. When I was there, this was the harvest of beans. You can see that there's hardly anything there. They know something is happening. They don't read the news all the time. They may listen to the radio or something, but they know something has changed. They know that there are international powers that play with this. They know that they don't have any choice on what they do. And so their response in this region is they have to cut down the trees to make charcoal to sell to Kenya, to Nairobi, because that's how people cook there. And of course, that's a vicious loop, because then cutting down the trees just makes it worse in the environment there. But they have no choice in that matter. So Kenyans like this, when I talked to them, it was about, they framed it in terms of justice. That's what it was about for them. Often, you know, in my classes, if we talk about, you know, ethical theories that have it to do with climate change, for instance, we talk about what sorts of moral obligations we have to situations like this, to folks in other places who are marginalized, whose voices can't be heard, or to other generations, or to nature itself, which also doesn't have the voice that it should. And the reason that I say all of that is that CSCS, you can see some of the wording we have on the website. I won't go through all of that, but one of the ways that has resonated with people is this phrase right down in here, which we came up with early on. We said, we envision the church responding to climate change as a moral equivalent to peace building. This is in the Anabaptist context, and I know different churches respond to peace building differently, but still that tradition is pretty deeply embedded in a lot of Anabaptist communities. So we believe that climate change is on the level of that, and that we have a moral obligation because of people like Kanina and Moya to respond to that. And again, that Anabaptists can do something, and that in the larger climate community, we have something unique to contribute. If you want to answer, what does CSCS do? Okay, this is a little wonky here, I admit, but I'm gonna illustrate it with a couple of stories, try to make it more memorable. What we do in our objectives and like our strategic plan, if you're into those type of things, we break it down into 3 areas: inspiring action, building networks, and training leaders. Programmatically, we work in 4 different areas: with students, with congregations, and what's called a Global Voices program, and with innovation. Okay, so my illustration, rather than giving the dry explanation, here's the people to illustrate this. So this is Clara Wainwright. Some of the EMU folks will know her. She graduated last year from EMU. She was an intern with the MCC Washington office. She got, and then she's a fellow presently, and will actually be in DC where the ride ends. She got really passionate about advocacy. Actually, even before she got involved with CSCS, but she didn't have the experience with it. So she did an internship with MCC Washington through CSCS. So we arranged this. And through that experience, she found out that she loves that. She can talk all evening about this, about the details of legislature and everything. Those of you that know her can attest to that. And she has reached out to a lot of the churches in the Mennonite communities. She's had a one-year fellowship with us where she proposed the project and then we sponsored that. And part of that was connecting churches and connecting students. You may have seen this article in the Anabaptist World by Clara describing her experience of connecting some students to advocacy in Washington, D.C. She's now going on to law school. She's going to do amazing things. She is an example of how we are training, I would say we are training leaders at CSCS. The Global Voices program, so this is Sibanokule Nkube. She is a Zimbabwean. She's been involved with us for now 2 or 3 years. She came during a first what we call a Global Voices tour. So we brought some folks over from El Salvador, Nepal, and Zimbabwe and toured some 40 or 50 different places, churches, schools, other venues to tell their stories of climate change. She has stayed engaged with us. She is now on a list of, the panel on the right shows a list of folks in our speakers bureau. And so she is available, for instance, for congregations or other venues who want to talk about some of the things that, some of the perspectives that she can give from her many years of experience doing development work and church work in Zimbabwe. So that's an example of the Global Voices program. We work with congregations, much of that, this could fall in any of these 3 sort of objective areas. Much of that, though, is building networks. So Doug Kaufman, who some of you may know, he's on the lower right here. He's our director of pastoral ecology. He has spent a lot of time developing pastor and congregational leader retreats on climate change. So this brings together pastors in regions, especially this was one in Los Angeles that brought folks from MCUSA, Mennonite Brethren, other Anabaptist churches together for 2 or 3 days before COVID in order to talk about climate change. And in particular, he is very good at thinking about the emotions around climate change. I know that came up in a number of panelists. I noticed you're just thinking about the issues of anxiety and hope and how those can serve as barriers or enablers to respond to these issues. We work closely with other organizations. The picture here, actually, this is Jennifer Schrock. Those of you that know Mennonite Creation Care Network, which is a different organization than ours. And so that gets confusing sometimes, but we work very closely with them because our missions do align in some ways. And this is just a slide of Doug's recent workshop in Lancaster with Mennonites in Pennsylvania there. He's gone to having some of this online and is developing a curriculum for this. Then my last example I put under innovation, these 2 folks right here, Harrison and Michaela, they were also graduates of Mennonite College. They also had a fellowship, so we funded them for a year to create this podcast, Shifting Climates. In a way, they did much of what the Climate Ride is doing very successfully, also going around and talking to communities, not trying to educate communities, but really listening to their perspectives on this to try to sort of figure out what is the way forward in being able to have conversations about this. If you know Harrison or Michaela, you also know that they are very committed to the church. They're very creative people. And so in our innovative programs area, where this is not just like scientific innovation, this is social innovation, this is theological innovation. It is new ways of engaging folks with climate issues. And I think that Harrison and Michaela illustrated that very well. Those are 4 examples. These are some of the other pictures. There are many others. Actually, these are folks that have been or are currently involved with CSCS in many different areas. And we are so grateful for folks like these, because the people that come to us tend to be just very committed to this issue, and are wonderful folks to work with. So we invite you again to join the story, join the journey through the different ways that you can engage online if you're close to the journey, to come in person where it's safe and you're able. You can go to our website. We invite supporters, of course, as well. I'm a scientist by training, so I wasn't trained to ask for donations, but I have learned in this job as director of CSCS that people like giving to organizations that they feel like the organization is making a large difference. And so I invite you, if you follow the journey, if you think that CSCS is making a difference, then by all means. But we want to engage you in many different ways. So please be in contact, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully at other town halls as well. So I'm going to end there. I want to thank the climate riders. I know that they have had a long day, and they got a big day tomorrow because they're heading out at 7 o'clock going east, and it's 3,700 miles until they end. Thank you again, Elaine, Kate, Daniel. It's been a rich experience to have you folks there. So yes, everybody have a very good evening.